Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books out loud while stoned. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book, and it is Little Blue Book number 1127, and it is titled Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe. Now, this is book number 2 in a 3-book series that he wrote, book number 1 being the one just before this, called The Degradation of Women. Book number 3 coming up after this will be Christianity and Education. But for right now, we are on book number 2. Book number 1127, Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe, and primarily in the 20s. I don't think this has a copyright date. Nope. Primarily in the 1920s. All right, so here's the table of contents. There are 5 chapters. Chapter 1 being Paganism and Slavery. Chapter 2, The Gospel and the Slave. Chapter 3, The Christian Serf. Chapter 4, Black Slavery. And Chapter 5, The Churches and the Workers. And so we'll begin now with Chapter 1, Paganism and Slavery. About the year 100 AD, 2 remarkable lectures on slavery were delivered in Rome. The central part of Rome was a very broad, open space, the Forum, crowded with statues and works of art, lined with beautiful marble temples and public halls. In these halls, lectures were delivered, just as they are in New York and Chicago today. And as the Romans knew and practiced shorthand, as well as we do, many of the lectures have been preserved for us. The orator to whom I now refer was the eloquent Greek Stoic Dion Chrysostom, or Dion of the Golden Mouth. He was no demagogue. At times, you would see him driving about Rome with the great emperor Trajan, or of whom he was an intimate friend. He was the idol of the thoughtful section of the Roman nobility, and for 2 days, the subject was too large for one day. Dion had announced as his subject slavery. A delicate topic, one would imagine, if pagan Rome were quite the slave-driving city it is commonly supposed to have been. Unless the aristocratic orator intended to justify the institution for his aristocratic audience, every member of which owned many slaves. But Dion, as we read in the extant lectures, denounced slavery as unjust. About the same time, there was in Rome a very democratic poet named Juvenal, who was putting in fiery verse or satire certain statements about the brutality of the Roman aristocrats to their slaves. Every religious writer in the world knows these satires of Juvenal, although every classical authority in the world will warn you not to take their statements seriously. But no religious writer in the world seems ever to have heard of Dion Chrysostom and his denunciation of slavery. It is quite formal, explicit, and lengthy. It fills 2 lectures. Dion rightly says that when the Romans adopted slavery, they were making a humane improvement upon an earlier custom. The older practice was to put to death men taken captive in war. The soldier's business was to see that the fighters, or potential fighters, on the side of the enemy were annihilated. Then the Romans, as they became civilized, gave the captives their lives, but made slaves of them. The time has come, Dion says, to recognize a higher standard. If this method of making slaves is not just, then all the other methods bear the taint of injustice, so that no one can truly be called a slave. Here is an express and honorable condemnation of slavery by a well-known friend of the emperor, in the most public and effective circumstances, at a time when the Christians were a mere handful of obscure folk mumbling a Greek liturgy and debating whether the end of the world was at hand. Strange that you never heard of this before, you may say. You were given the impression that the pagan world lived almost entirely on the labor of slaves, treated the slaves brutally, and never perceived the injustice and inhumanity of the arrangement. You thought that it was one of the specific services of Christianity to the world, that it broke the fetters of the slave. And I tell the religious reader once more, as I do in The Degradation of Women, Little Blue Book number 1122, book just before this one, that what is still said on the subject from end to end of Christendom is the exact opposite of the undisputed historical truth. We'll pause for hydration. I am, as I said, in 4 books, examining 4 specific and important Christian claims of service to the race. The clergy claimed that Christianity elevated women, and we saw that it actually and demonstrably degraded women in Little Blue Book number 1122. Now, we have the claim that the church denounced and abolished slavery, and we shall see, on the same plain and incontrovertible historical evidence, that it never denounced slavery and had nothing to do with the abolition of it. Then we shall find exactly the same situation in regard to the claim of the church gave the world schools. Little Blue Book number 1128, coming up after this book. Taught the world purity, inspired art, fostered learning, or in any way helped civilization. I do not love strong statements. They are apt to please the people of your own party, but alienate the sympathy of those whom you wish to convince. Here, however, I deliberately say to the religious reader that the claims of service with which he is familiar are the exact opposite of the truth, and there is no dispute about the facts. Another drink. I proved that, surely, in The Degradation of Women, Little Blue Book number 1122. It is just as easy to prove that it is the reverse of the truth to say that Christianity abolished slavery and gave the world education. And I say this knowing well that H.G. Wells has endorsed the Christian claim. H.G. Wells is very popular at this time. No one admires Wells' ability and service to this generation more than I do. But here he made, or borrowed, a statement which he had never examined. I have minutely examined these 4 claims and the original evidence in connection with them in a series of works. The Bible in Europe, The Religion of Women, Women and Political Evolution, The Church and the People, The Influence of the Church on Marriage, and Divine Crises in the History of the Papacy, etc. He's written many books. And I speak confidently, in this book, I will show that the undisputed historical facts are that, 1. The Greek and Roman moralists perceived the injustice of slavery, often denounced it, and rendered great service to the slave. 2. No Christian leader denounced slavery until the 9th century, when the age of slavery was over. 3. In the Christian Middle Ages, the workers were far worse off because nearly everyone was a serf, and serfdom was slavery under another name. And 4. The betterment of condition of the workers has been one quite independently of religion and, to an enormous extent, in spite of the churches. Those are 4 very good big points. We are not concerned here with slavery in the pagan world, generally, but only in that part of the world, the Roman Empire, in which Christianity came to confront it. To try to make a point of the broad fact that paganism in general was based upon slavery and Christendom was not is foolish. And in any case, we had better wait and see upon what kind of labor Christendom was based. The slave in Greece, he married, held property, and was humanely treated, was better off than the Christian serf. As to Egypt and Babylonia, we cannot say to what extent there was slavery and how slaves were generally treated. Very different figures are given of the proportion of slaves in the Roman Republic and Empire. Recent authorities admit that all these figures are rash and most of them greatly exaggerated. It is safe only to say that probably there were more than 2 slaves to each free man in the 100 million people of the empire. They were mostly farm laborers in provinces. A successful war might bring into the empire 100,000 captives, and they were enslaved on the great imperial corn estates or on private estates. In Rome, there were between 300,000 and 400,000 free workers. It was on their labor that the city rested. The Roman slaves were mainly domestic, and they were not, as a rule, ill-treated. On the immense farms in the provinces, the captured Gauls, or Germans, or Slavs were at first vilely treated. Lamentable as it was, it hardly becomes a Christian to throw stones. He forgets that while Romans were then only a few centuries removed from barbarian, Christendom, nearly 2,000 years later, set up a system of black slavery with equally vile conditions. Into this Roman world came the theories and sentiments of the Greek philosophers. The Roman fully recognized the superior culture of the older civilization across the Adriatic Sea, and it was not long before every educated Roman was either a Stoic or an Epicurean, or both, for they blended the two, taking the best qualities and omitting the defects of each. In practice, however, it was chiefly the Stoic ethic which informed their views on public questions. It is amusing to read Christian writers on the Stoics. The popular writer and the preacher, of course, have never heard of the Stoics. Their views of ancient history are melodramatic, even comic. All the world was wicked and polytheistic until the wonderfully original gospel of Christ came along. The Christian scholar knows better, and he has to notice the Stoic religion. He calls it a religion because he has to admit that its moral code was very high as the Christian. And he is not willing to admit that there could be such a high code apart from religion. It was not a religion. It never urged any man to worship the gods, if there were any, and it expressly disassociated the moral code from gods, or anything spiritual. The Stoics were materialists. The complaint of the Christian scholar generally is that it was a very fine but a very aristocratic moral code. It was for the intellectuals, the educated. It was a philosophy. It was cold. Christianity was warm, was simple, was calculated to appeal to the great mass of the people and get things done. And we may readily admit that Stoicism, as such, could never be the guiding principle of the world. It was an ethical exaggeration, and the mass of the people will in practice never tolerate moral exaggerations, Christian or otherwise. It was a philosophy, whereas the need for a plain human rule of life based upon experience. Yet the Christian scholar who talks learnedly about the futility of Stoicism is as blind as a bat. Stoicism simply transformed Roman sentiment by its doctrine of the equality and brotherhood of men. It had a magnificent practical triumph. Let me again underline a truth, which is simple historical fact. There have in history been two great periods of benevolence and social services. One was under the pagan Stoics, and the other is under modern paganism. The Christian era lies between these two paganisms, and it has as poor a record of social service as any can imagine. You can learn the truth of this in regard to women. Little Blue Book number 1122, the book before this. Now for the slave. Elsewhere, you may learn about education. Little Blue Book number 1128. And philanthropy. That'll be the next book. It is an historical fact, supported by the most positive of evidence, says the Protestant historian Dr. E. Reich, that slavery in the Roman Empire was mitigated by the noble philosophy of the Stoic, and not by the teaching of the Church Fathers, who never thought of recommending the abolition of slavery. History of Civilization, page 421. By the 1st century, the Stoics, as we saw, openly condemned slavery. Other Greek moralists besides the Stoics condemned it. Plutarch condemned it. Epicurus had come near to condemning it 3 centuries earlier, when he had defined the slave as a friend in the inferior condition. And the Epicurean Agassiz had maintained that slaves were the equals of free men. Florentinus and Alpane, the two famous Stoic jurists, declared that the enslavement of a man was against the law of nature, the supreme standard of the Stoic. Seneca insisted that the slaves were our lowly friends, and he pleaded repeatedly and nobly for them. Pliny shows us in his letters that by the 2nd century the slaves were very humanely treated, even on provincial estates. Juvenal fiercely attacked inhumanity to slaves. Yet, I presume that all that any religious reader is likely to know about Roman slavery is that the rich partitions had large armies of slaves on their estates and treated them like cattle. He is never told that this refers to the early period of Roman expansion, and that before the end of the 1st century, the slaves were, as we shall see, protected by law. He has probably heard how Cato made some callous remark about his slaves, and he is not told that the pagan writer who has preserved it for us gives it expressly as an instance of a mean and ungenerous spirit. Quite certainly, he will have heard how rich Romans used to throw their slaves to the fishes, and he is never told that only once such case is recorded, and that the pagan writer who records it says that the patrician once in question was worthy of 1,000 deaths for his brutality. Seneca on Clemency 1:18. Thus is the faith defended. I imagine that any thoughtful clergyman would refer me for the Christian case against the pagans to Brace's Gesta Christini. It is in this section a tissue of inaccuracies and sophistry. Mr. Brace first asks us to admire the thoughtfulness of Jesus in not condemning slavery, because it would have led to economic chaos. A lot Jesus, the prophet of poverty, the predictor of the end of the world, cared about economic chaos. Moreover, if any man supposes that a condemnation of slavery by Jesus would have influenced the Roman world before the 5th century, he has a singular idea of history. Mm. Mm. Mr. Brace then placidly turns round on the pagans, who may be presumed to have had some concern for economic stability, and censures them for not abolishing slavery. He is not even just to them. He tells us that old and infirm slaves were exposed on an island in the Tiber. Naturally, in the temples of Asclepius, which were hospitals. He asks us to believe that Juvenal, the Bolshevik of the time, disdained slaves. And we find, on looking up the passage to which Mr. Brace gives the usual wrong reference, that Juvenal has put the words into the mouth of a Roman aristocrat. Mr. Brace recognizes the sentiments of the Stoics, but they had, he says, only a superficial influence. Let us see. The Cornelian Law, BC 82, made the murder of a slave equally punishable with that of a free man. The Petronian Law, BC 32, forbade masters to send their slaves to fight wild beasts in the amphitheater. The Emperor Nero enabled the slave to appeal to court against bad treatment on the part of his master. The Emperor Hadrian abolished the old subterranean dungeons for slaves, renewed the laws which punished the murder of a slave or the use of slaves in the amphitheater, and banished a wealthy lady for cruelty to her slaves. The Emperor Antoninus Pius enacted that a slave who sought refuge from a cruel or hard master at an altar or an imperial statue would be sold to a new master. The Emperor Caracalla forbade parents to sell their children as slaves. The Emperor Diocletian forbade a man to sell himself as a slave or a creditor to enslave a debtor. A dozen other laws protected the slave from injustice or vile treatment. An account of them will be found in the two principal works on slavery, Ingram's Slavery and Serfdom, and Latruinau's, and that L'Evolution de les Esclavages. And I've probably butchered that, but it's in French. The truth is that all the Christian writers on the subject are befogged by the old idea of the history of the world. The Roman Empire was wicked and polytheistic. Christianity was virtuous and zealous. We have seen how false this old picture is. Precisely in the time of Christ, the Greco-Roman world was witnessing a remarkable moral and religious advance. Dr. John Oakesmith has a useful chapter, chapter 7, of his Religion of Plutarch, on what he calls the strenuous moral earnestness that came over the Roman world just before the time of Christ. And I will quote his summary. And here we quote. The moral reformation officially inaugurated by Augustus, 27 BC to 14 AD, appears in the light of these indications as corresponding to an increased tendency to virtue, actually leavening Greco-Roman society. The formal acts of the Caesar, the policy of his ministers, the religious sentiments of Horace and of Virgil, the stoic fervor of Seneca and of Lucian, the martyr spirit of the Thraces and the Ares, the tyrannizing morality of Juvenal, the kindly humanity of Pliny the Younger, the missionary enthusiasm of Dion, the gentle persuasiveness of Plutarch, are all common indications of the good that still interfused the Roman world. All point, as indeed many other signs also point, to the existence of a widespread belief that virtuous ideals and virtuous actions were an inheritance of which mankind ought not to allow itself to be easily deprived." Unquote. The two leading recent works on the period, the French academician G. Bozier's Religion Romaine and Sir Samuel Dill's Roman Society from Nero to Marcus Aurelius, entirely agree with this. The idea of the age was high, and we find, in accordance with it, as Sir S. Dill says, that the slave is treated by all the great leaders of moral reform as a being of the same mold as his master, his equal, if not superior, in captivity for virtue. Page 3. That is the end of chapter 1 of Little Blue Book number 1127, titled Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe. And that's where we're going to stop for this video. Join me for part 2.